benefit one another. Elden Ring is that cycle. The idea that a game like this came out in the current state of gaming where it feels just so empty and lifeless, aside from some outliers, shows that there is a glimmer of hope for the industry as a whole. The impact this game brought to the Soulsborne genre when it was released, all the way up to now, coupled with the insane popularity, is something I'll never forget. It is that game where I wish I could wipe my memory and play it from the beginning all over again. And with DLC potentially coming soon, that most likely will never change. And quite honestly, I'm happy about that.
Rise now, ye tarnished.
As a product, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is an enigma. FromSoftware has had a near perfect track record in their games, so much so that even their black sheep, Dark Souls 2, was still able to win awards for its time. That alone speaks volumes about their pedigree. And this goes doubly so with their DLCs and expansions. For as long as I could tell, being a big FromSoftware fan, their expansions were always able to elevate their respective games. For Dark Souls 1, it was Notorious of the Abyss. For Bloodborne, it was the famous Old Hunters. For Dark Souls 3, it was the Ring City, easily a top favorite of mine. And Sekiro was collecting dust for 5 years. So a lot of excitement was riding on Elden Ring's first and only expansion that they would ever put out, Shadow of the Erdtree. And after I, at minimum, have played it, and at maximum, allowed it to take over my whole damn life, I will have to say this. If you still think that the Old Hunters is better, you have nostalgia goggles on, and are still, much like me, coping and hoping that Papa Sony will one day give it the upgrades that it deserves. Please give us a PC port, Kaisenat, you are our only hope. This doesn't just elevate Elden Ring, this takes the game to its zenith. I put 2 playthroughs in Shadow of the Erdtree now, and close to around 20 to 30 hours into it. I can very confidently say that this is the best expansion that FromSoftware has ever put out, and has solidified Elden Ring as a whole to be my favorite game of all time. Very few games are able to check all the boxes like this game does, and it's something that I wish I talked more and more about, and in better detail, in my first video. Gosh, that video still makes me cringe. So now this DLC has given me more than enough to do exactly that today. I was contemplating on how I wanted to approach this because I really wanted to call this Game of the Year 2024, but I know that I can't legitimately because the Game of the Year label is reserved for games of this year, and it's a DLC of a 2-year-old game, so taking that away from the other games is unfair, especially when you have games like Hades 2 and Balatro. I will do videos on that, I promise, don't worry. However, I now know exactly what I'm going to call it. Elden Ring is the game of the generation for me, and it's time to talk and gush about why I hold this game in high regard. But this isn't just going to be a normal postscript like I did with Callisto Protocol. No. This is getting a full love letter treatment. So, without further ado, let's dive right back into the world of the Erdtree and the realm of Shadow. This is my love letter to Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree. FromSoft has always been an absolute king in terms of art direction and communicating a story through its world building. They have created some of the best looking worlds of our generation, and they all tell a story beautifully. So you can imagine my shock when we take Miquella's gross looking hand, and I walk outside and am immediately gobsmacked by how amazing the Realm of Shadow is and what horrors that await me. The Realm of Shadow is a massive world, much like the base game. Far more so than I expected. As big as Limgrave, my ass, Miyazaki. It's one of death and isolation, as evidenced by the gravestones scattered around the plains. Really adds to that sense of curiosity and discovery that open world games wish to strive for. What makes it so much more satisfying is the level design. Each new environment having so many ways of approaching it and having such impressive levels of verticality and uniqueness makes it one of the best open world games ever made. It also helps establish the atmosphere that they were able to achieve with it as you progress. With all that being said though, I do wish that there was more to do within the world. While yes, the environments are some of the best that FromSoft has made, I just wish that you were given more to do in them. This could also be a byproduct of the base game being as big as it is, but it's even more so apparent here. The worst offender of this that I can think of is the Finger Ruins. There are massive ruins that are fantastic looking, but there's barely anything to really do in it aside from blowing the hanging bells that gives you an additional pretty good item as well as completes a side quest. They serve a purpose for that quest line, but even then they still could have at least maybe condensed it down so that it doesn't feel so empty. The map at times just feels too big, but despite that they still managed to make meaningful areas that don't have much in them, but have a lot of impact nonetheless. One of my favorite areas in the game is the Abyssal Woods. The haunting atmosphere, the dreadful score accommodating it, and coupled with these creepy lantern creatures a la Bloodborne that you cannot kill normally, makes this area all the more haunting, like something out of a classic horror game. And with all of it culminating in one of the best legacy dungeons in the game with Midra's Manse. Easily the best area in the game though come down to two, the Shadowkeep and the Shaman Village. Shadowkeep has so much going for it and has some of the best level design in the entire series. 3 important bosses take place here, and each have different ways of approaching this massive castle and so on. It's genuinely one of the best areas in Elden Ring, period. Shaman Village is also one of those best areas for the exact opposite reasons. It doesn't have multi-layered level design, but holds some of the biggest narrative significance in the entire DLC. So yeah, the open world may be conflicting for some, and I do wish that it wasn't as big as it is, because you can tell that they were just throwing things in. But for me, it just hits the right notes it needs to, with some room for more growth in the future. One of Elden Ring's biggest strengths, in my opinion, has always been the importance of build diversity and how you can approach the game with the tools given. The biggest reason is that it takes all of the best mechanics from their previous games and melds them together harmoniously. The standard Dark Souls combat, the crowd and rallying in Bloodborne, power stancing from Dark Souls 2 makes a return, which lets you unlock whole new movesets. Even the stealth and posture breaking from Sekiro is in this game in some way, which allows you to do a lot more damage than you normally would do. All this coupled with horseback combat, jump attacks, guard counters, even summoning AI has been reworked by giving you ashes to use, mainly the Mimic tier, which is easily the best one. So with all that laid out, how does it hold up in the DLC?
Okay. Fuck.
Well, Miyazaki must have known that a lot of players would want to go into this DLC expecting to blow straight through it, and then just said, bet, let's humble them instead. If you've noticed by now, the new enemies in this DLC do ludicrous amounts of damage to you. Pretty insane, yeah? Well, thankfully we have assistance here. In the Realm of Shadow, you have the ShadowOfTheErdtree fragments and revered spirit ashes, and these will be crucial to your success in this DLC. The developers must have thought so also because there was an emergency patch to boost the power they have. ShadowOfTreee fragments can be spent in the Sites of Grace to level up your character and specifically increases the amount of damage you can do and decreases the amount of damage that you take within the Realm of Shadow, while the Spirit Ashes do the same thing but only with your spirits as well as Torrent. The higher the level of your fragments, the higher your chances of survival are to get through the Realm of Shadow at a max of 20 levels. Now there's also still that level advantage you get based on how high of a level your character is, but for the most part it's paramount that you find these fragments all across the map. I for one absolutely love this system because not only does it encourage exploration, but it also comes really in handy so that way you're not constantly getting one or two shot by specific enemies or bosses. Which is why I always recommend you find these fragments in ASAP because that information alone will help you out greatly. Does it make the game easier? Oh hell no. But nothing stops you from taking the systems of this game to your advantage, especially with this new level scaling. Which then segues us into what I consider to be the second part of this game, by far, which is the new weapons. There are a shit ton of new weapons in Shadow of the Erdtree, and a large majority of the ones that I've tested are really damn good. Arguably some of the best weapons I've had in Elden Ring in general. New weapon types, new movesets, new fun Ashes of War, and weapon arts are all really fun and do a lot of damage and are really well made. One of my favorite weapons was the Great Sword of Solitude, as the stagger chances are incredibly good at close range. There's shields that also can double as melee weapons, so you can be both offensive and defensive. There's also a martial arts weapon when you get from beating Dryleaf Dane that leads to some really cool martial art moves and other Ashes of War. It looks absolutely amazing. Great katanas are a great addition to the game as well, especially the Dragon Hunter's Great Katana, which makes dragon hunting 10 times more fun. But my personal favorite weapons are the light greatswords. My personal favorite weapon is Milady. It has customizability with other Ashes of War, has unique graceful moveset, which rewards good timing and precise moves, and also comes with its own free Tips Fedora emote. Nah, I'm kidding. But the point is, it's amazing, and I just wanted to gush about it a little bit. Armor sets look just as good too. Both new characters and bosses we'll get to that. There's a huge reason why I'm more of a Fashion Souls guy, because 9 times out of 10, I care less about the stats of the armor and more about the looks. There's one particular armor that I will never take off, but I won't say right now because of spoilers. So, if there's one thing I will say though, is that the new magic stuff for magic builds is kinda shit. Some of them cost way too much in terms of stats, but do so little damage, it almost kinda doesn't matter. Although, I think some of the patches more recently have actually benefited that. That, and there's so many damn cookbooks in this, that if Chef Ramsay had these, no other chef in the universe would stand a chance. Crafting is a neat idea, and definitely can be helpful in a tight spot, but for me, I never felt the need to use it, but it serves its purpose, although the DLC did encourage me to do more crafting, which I will give them props for. Then this leads up to the enemies, and a lot of them have a lot of cool designs, and a large majority of them are fun to fight against. Although it may just me, but some of them are also just kinda threatening at first. The furnace golems, for example, are massive in size, and can kill you instantly from close and long range until you find out they can be killed. But there's also giant scorpions, so yeah, that's fun. Of course, the winter lanterns that I mentioned before in the Abyssal Woods are not nice. These things, they're not nice. Shadow of the Erdtree adds so much from the base game while also keeps players on the same playing field without the need to change the numbers, among other things, and it's such a unique breath of fresh air. But let's now get into it. It's time to discuss bosses and overall difficulty.
Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death. In the embrace of Mesmer's flame.
The topic of boss design and boss quality has definitely been an interesting one over the last 2 years of Elden Ring's life cycle. I myself has always said that Elden Ring's bosses are some of the best that I've ever encountered and have some of the most memorable moments I've ever had the pleasure of fighting for me. The DLC has their fair share of great bosses in this game too. However, I don't know if I can say that they're better than the base game. For context, every other DLC had the best bosses that are better than the base game. Dark Souls 1 had Artorias, Manus, and Black Dragon Calamite. Dark Souls 2 had bosses like the Fume Knight and the Ivory King. Bloodborne is heavily carried by its bosses in the Old Hunters like Lady Maria, My Beloved, Ludwig, and the Orphan of Kos. Dark Souls 3 had Sister Fried, Dark Eater Midir, and Slave Knight Gale, and you basically get the point. So now the question is, how do the bosses fare in the DLC in comparison to the Elden Ring base game? Well, I'd like to think that these DLC bosses are just as good as the base game, if not better, which kind of speaks volumes of how good the base game's bosses were in my opinion. However, I will say that Shadow of the Erdtree might have more favorites of mine than the base game. A really good starting fight is the Dancing Lion, for example. He's an absolute wild card as the fight goes on, and though the camera can get a bit wonky with him, just overall, it's a great fight. Mesmer in particular is an absolutely fantastic fight from beginning to end, so much so that I kind of wish he was harder. He's got a lot of easily telegraphed attacks that have massive delays, but once you figure out his tells, he's pretty easy, especially in my second playthrough. I took him down in like 2 tries, so maybe I just wish he was a little bit tougher, especially in second phase. But everything else, from the visuals to the arena to the music to the voice acting, it's all perfect, if not the closest thing to it. There's a lot of great bosses like R'Lana, Romana, Metyr, Scadutree Avatar, Baal the Dread. And even though some of the weaker bosses designed, like Commander Gaius, have some really fun mechanics to them, even though those charge hitboxes need to seriously be tweaked, I don't think I've ever had a bad experience with any of the new bosses, despite some issues that I do have, but overall, just really well designed bosses. That being said, there is a couple of things I do think that are kinda shitty. The NPC bosses, for example, are kinda ridiculous in terms of damage, even with upgrades. That, and there's some of the reused bosses in the DLC. Although, for whatever reason, Miyazaki decided to reuse some of the worst bosses in the base game. Now, I will say right now that reusing bosses isn't inherently bad, but the issue is more or less which bosses they decided to reuse. For example, the Falling Star Beast and the Deathrite Birds I dreaded seeing because I hated those bosses in the base game. But then there's also bosses like the Tree Sentinels, which I actually think are really fun, so I liked fighting those again. So for me, the topic of reused bosses is very iffy and complicated because there were some I did like and some that I didn't like, and let's be honest, at least it wasn't a Godskin trio or some other shit, so I'll take that, I suppose. A lot of people compared the reusage of bosses in Elden Ring to Dark Souls 2. I feel as though is somewhat unfair given how large Elden Ring is in comparison to DS2. That and a lot of DS2's bosses had bigger issues, and a large amount of them were rehashes on top of that, so that made it even worse when you go in and fight the same boss you killed 5 hours ago. So I don't think the comparisons are 100% fair, but I can understand why people think that. But then we get to the overall discussion of the difficulty in this game. When the DLC came out, on Steam it was rated as mixed for quite a while, mostly because of either performance issues or people complaining about the difficulty saying that it's simply too hard. My biggest issue with this is that whether or not I agree with the idea that it's too hard, because I really don't, but it's more so because this is something FromSoft has always done. The base game of a Souls game is 9 times out of 10 a lot easier than the DLC that comes after. For example, the Old Hunters was a hell of a lot harder than the base game of Bloodborne, as it was home to one of the hardest bosses ever in Orphan of Kos. In the same case with Shadow of the Erdtree, it's easily 10 times tougher than the base game outside of, say, Millennia, of course, but all those that try to tell you that this game is too hard, I don't necessarily agree with. EldenRing is easily the most accessible of all the games. Separate builds, separate styles, and all types of customization at your own fingertips, and it encourages one style to play, playing it your own way. The game gives you all the options you need to either make the game easier or harder for yourself, more so than other previous games. All those trying to tell you that it's simply too hard are all just huffing massive amounts of copium. You can argue that some aspects of bosses need fine-tuning, like Commander Gaius, like I mentioned earlier, and certain enemies do too much and damage, etc. Regardless, the game gives you the tools necessary to win. A perfect example? The Erdtree fragments. You find those, you'll have a good chance for survival against a lot of the challenges, and FromSoft even encourages you to do so, both in-game and on Twitter. And yes, I know I'm trying to avoid the term skill issue, as at times that's used by a bunch of tryhards, but when Kai Cenat can be able to beat the final boss and still have a fun time and understand the game, then yeah, it's 100% a skill issue. I know that was a bit of a tirade there, but I see this happen all the time, and it pollutes the conversation and makes it difficult to talk about. But to close out this category, I just implore you to heed this advice. Play this game however you want to, and the way you want to do it. You'll have a lot of fun that way, and no matter what anyone else tells you, if you did it, you beat the game. That's that. Overall, I loved the bosses and had a blast with a lot of them, and while yes, it's harder than the base game, it was still the right amount of enjoyment. One of the things about Elden Ring that I've begun to really appreciate over time is just how good the story and the lore of this game is. Its way of being able to tell a story before the characters even utter so much as a word really needs to be studied, as it's kinda crazy with how good they've been able to stick with it after all these years. Shadow of the Erdtree is no different in this regard. The entire realm of Shadow feels disconnected, but not in a way that's detrimental to the plot, but rather one that feels like it's intentional, like something or someone is trying to hide what happened within this place. Before we get any further, just know that I will be briefly talking about certain aspects of lore, as I'm saving more of it for my boss ranking video, so be on the lookout for that. But if you want a more in-depth look on the story and the lore revelations that the DLC provides, I recommend watching Smoughtowns. He did an amazing video covering the story as a whole and the amount of lore bombshells that we got. Link will be in the description. But there is specifically one thing that I want to be able to talk about, and it's that the actual story of Shadow of the Erdtree is one more about repeating the sins of the past. For the last 2 years, fans have speculated on whether or not Miquella is truly still alive, or what exactly his plan is, and what he's doing. 2 years later, we now know what his plans are, and we see it unfold as the DLC goes on. Over the course of the DLC, you find these crosses all over the map that are actually remnants of Miquella that he has discarded within the Realm of Shadow, including his heart, his doubts, even his love. What I love about the story at the beginning is the sense of mystery. Then you come across the characters of the Realm of Shadow, and they were all members of previous demigods, like Freya, who is a member of Radahn's royal guard, the Hornsent, who is a last of a once known of his race that serves the Crucible, Tolier, who is loyal to Saint Trina, Egon, the biggest Giga Chad in the DLC, and Sir Ansbach, who is loyal to Mohg. Ansbach is probably the best character for me. His honor and loyalty to Mohg is absolute, and he's arguably one of the nicer characters in the game. He learns more about Miquella's intentions, and he questions why he should follow Miquella. Once you reach the Shadowkeep, you'll notice that a Great Rune is broken, as well as a charm. A charm that's been manipulating the characters over the course of the DLC. They begin to question whether or not their loyalty to Miquella was real, or if it was all a ruse. Though, one of those who remains throughout it all is Needle Knight Letta. It all culminates to one of the cooler parts of the game. You end up killing Mesmer in order to get his kindling and burn the shadows away. And once you burn it all, what's left is a giant tower. And before we reach the top, we have to fight some of the friends that we made along the way, and it's arguably one of the cooler parts in the game, is that the amount of people is dependent on the questlines you do, and you can do so in any order. Though it's still quite a bit of a ridiculous fight damage-wise. We then get to the top of the tower, and the first thing we see, a giant gate. The Gate of Divinity. And we finally see what Miquella's plan is.
My loyal blade and champion of the festival. Both your deeds will ever be praised in song. Now, the vow will be honored, and my lord brother's soul will return, so that he may be my consort.
But wait a minute, Radahn is back? We killed him though. Why is he here? What is Miquella's plan? Well, it's mainly to ascend to godhood, and he sacrificed it all to do so, all in the name of creating a world guided by compassion. Though, the biggest thing is, how can he create a world of kindness and compassion, even though he abandoned his love to get there? I saw a comment on a video on Miquella called A Deconstruction of Villainy, link will be in the description as well, and it read the following. The second Miquella discarded Saint Trina, his entire plan becomes invalidated. You can't create a world of kindness and compassion if you throw away your love. It was then it hit me that Miquella isn't breaking the cycle. He's only making the same mistakes that his mother, Marika, did. Earlier in the playthrough, we come across the Shaman Village, which is found out to be Marika's hometown, and where we find more about what caused the events and the creation of the Golden Order as a whole, which I could go on for hours about, but I'm just gonna explain it in a small summit. In short, the Hornsent tortured her people. Marika wanted revenge, so she had Mesmer and his army go and exact revenge on them. She then approached the Gate of Divinity and decided to become a god. Then hid her child Mesmer and his army in the Realm of Shadow in order to hide the atrocities that had happened here. I mention this all now because it adds a lot to Miquella's actions, as while they're not one-to-one the same, the similarities became more clear to me. Miquella is removing traces of him related to the Golden Order in order so that he can descend to godhood and create his world of kindness and compassion, completely ignoring the atrocity he commits and that we helped do for him. And as the saying goes, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Miquella isn't breaking that cycle. He's only repeating it, but in different ways, which in a way makes him not only an incredibly tragic character, but also one of the best written characters that From has created, as icky as he is in certain areas. But why exactly is Radahn the promised consort? For a lot of people, they all thought it was going to be Godwyn, which I'm not going to get into because the plot holes that would create would take a whole nother video, which I don't have time for. But basically, in a way, we helped Miquella give exactly what he wanted. We killed Mohg so that he can use his body. We killed Radahn so Miquella can have his soul, and that results in the warrior you see before you. The writing is so good, and there's so much to it that I'll probably go into more detail in my boss ranking video, but basically, we helped start this, and now we have to finish it. The Lord of the Old Order versus the Lord of the Old Order, to grant Saint Trina's wish to stop Miquella from becoming a prison to godhood, and free Radahn from his personal hell. A duel for the ages. I wouldn't have it any other way. And after all is said and done, we take him down. And there we have Shadow of the Erdtree. There are going to be people who disagree with me, but I genuinely think that this is the newest high for the series. It's nowhere near perfect, but I'd gladly go back to play this and the base game again and again. This is my favorite game of all time, and my game of the generation for a reason. A shame this will be the only DLC for this game, because I want more of this amazing universe with these amazing characters. But whatever Miyazaki has planned, I'm looking forward to it when it comes. The memories I have, and will continue to have for a long time, will forever burn into my mind as I go back to claim my place as the Elden Lord. And that is my love letter to Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree.